Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Big Bass Podcast, the fishing show where size matters. My name is Ken Duke.
And I'm Terry Battisti. Our producer and engineer is the lovely and robust Nathan Benson.
Rubenesque, if you will.
Rubenesque, exactly. For this episode of the Big Bass Podcast, we want to thank one of our subscribers, Casey Hepworth, who texted Ken and asked that we take a look at the Idaho Record largemouth bass, which I hold near and dear to my heart because I lived there for 20 some odd years. Anyway.
Yeah, Casey Hepworth texted me and he said, I'm from southern Idaho, born and raised. I am reaching out in hopes that Terry and you will look at the Idaho State largemouth bass record. On a parent record of 10.94 pounds at Anderson Lake by Mrs. M.W. Taylor with no date of catch, length, or girth. This seems fishy to me. Well, Casey, it seems fishy to me too. But now it is positively fascinating. The Idaho Record largemouth story is full of mystery, money, game violations, murder, redemption, forgiveness, and a very big surprise.
Yeah, Ken and I, especially me, I lived there for 20 some odd years, we're somewhat familiar with the Idaho Record, but we really didn't know much. But we know a lot more now, and after taking this deep dive into this, one of the oldest, at least substantiated state record largemouth bass in the country, a 10.94 pound fish, or 10 pounds, 15 ounces, caught in, well, the state doesn't really know when it was caught. When Ken first approached me about this, I went back to the Idaho Department of Fish and Game rule books, and it states in there, or stated in there, that it was caught in 1955. But now, as we're going to find out, the Idaho DFG did not know what they were talking about.
Yeah, if we were to give a shout out to the Idaho Department of Fish and Game right now, that shout out would be wrong! Wrong! If you look up all the state records for largemouth bass, and there are 49 of them, every state except Alaska, Idaho has by far the least amount of information on the fish.
Yeah, but what information do they have, Ken?
Well, yeah, they don't have much, but I'll let you run it down because you're a former Idahoan. They basically just have weight, angler name, sort of, and the fishery. I'm going to let you run those down for us, Terry, because you're practically in Idaho, even though you're sitting in Tennessee right now. Yeah.
So what do they have? Well, they've got the weight of the fish at 10 pounds, 15 ounces.
Well, actually, they don't, because they do it in decimals in Idaho.
Well, they did it in decimals, but the DFG game book, they had it in pounds and ounces, and that's how I knew it was 10-15.
Okay, if you look online at the Idaho Department of Fish and Game website, you'll see it says 10.94, which is rounding up from 10 pounds, 15 ounces. I mean, it's rounding up a tiny bit, but that's
because
it.
15 ounces is 0.9375.
Yep.
7 followed by 3. Yeah, it goes 10.94.
So, what do they have for length, Terry?
Nothing.
Terry, what do they have for girth?
Nothing.
What do they tell us about the date the fish was caught?
Wrong. Nothing.
What do they tell us about the gear that was used?
Nothing.
Oh my God.
About all we know is that it was caught at Anderson Lake near Harrison, Idaho, which is Kootenai County, just off the Coeur d'Alene River. Now, if anybody knows anything about Coeur d'Alene Lake, it's fed by the St. John's River, or excuse me, the St. Joe River and the Coeur d'Alene River. And the Coeur d'Alene River has 9 lakes off of it. They call it the Chain of Lakes. And the first lake going upriver from the main lake is Anderson Lake. And that's where this fish was caught.
It's not a big body of water either by major reservoir standards, certainly. It's only about 720 surface acres. Yep. And I happened to be talking to Brandon Palnick just a couple of days ago at a tackle show, and he told me that it's managed as a trophy fishery.
Yep,
and guys...
Yeah, it always has been.
when guys fish tournaments there, they rarely stop because apparently it's a tough one to get a fish that you're allowed to hang on to there. What do they tell us about the angler, Terry?
It's Miss M.W. Taylor.
Yeah, Mrs. M.W. Taylor. That's the only angler information that we have. And that was the beginning of the nightmare for me, Terry, because I'm the guy on the Big Bass podcast who has to find out where everybody was born and when and where they went to school and stuff like that because I have issues. And I was digging and digging and digging and digging and digging, and I finally found one newspaper article that referenced a Mrs. M.W. Taylor. And it was, from a long time ago. It was from the 50s, and it said that this guy the writer was talking about a 9-pound, 14-ounce largemouth that had come from an area they call the Eastern Empire or the Inland Empire. And he was saying this 9-pound something ounce fish was the biggest that had ever come out of there from the Inland Empire. And apparently he got a note or a letter from Mrs. Taylor. And so he reported in his article, he said this, and this article came out in 1949. He said, Mrs. M.W. Taylor of East 4038 4th Avenue reports she landed a largemouth last October in Anderson Lake, Idaho, that scaled 10 pounds, 15 ounces. Anderson Lake is near Harrison. And according to Ms. Taylor, the bass there will either take a water dog or plug anytime, end quote. So finally, I've got a little something to grab hold of. And Terry, you know so well because you research so much that you got to get a foothold before anything is going to break open. And that was kind of the first little foothold I got. So now I had an idea of when this fish was caught. That told me it was caught in October 1948. And it gave me the woman's address, which is really helpful if you're searching a very common surname like Taylor. Taylor, Smith, Jones, Johnson. Yeah. Oh my God, if you can get an address, you're well on your way. But so that information you had from all those old state reg books that it was 1955, absolutely incorrect.
Yeah.
And we have a report from 1949 that tells us October 48. But we still don't know much about Mrs. M.W. Taylor. We don't know where she was from. We don't know what her initials are. We don't even know if they're her initials or maybe if they're her husband's initials.
Yeah, because back then, women went by their husbands' names.
They sure did. And in fact, that's the case here. So I started searching M.W. Taylor. I searched M.W. Taylor and did not find a woman, but I searched M.W. Taylor and I finally tracked down her husband, who was Dr. Maurice Winfred Taylor. Born in 1881, died in 1971. He was born in Missouri. And once I found him, it was really easy to find his wife, of course. Dr. Taylor was a very successful dentist. And his wife was, and this is the name of the woman who has held the state record for largemouth bass since 1948 in Idaho. Her name was Mary Alice Hurt Taylor. And she was born April 22nd, 1885 in Keatsville, Missouri. She was the fifth of 8 children. She married the good doctor in 1901 when he was 19 years old and she was 16.
Oh my gosh.
Not that uncommon back then.
Oh, cradle robber.
Yeah. They had one child together, a daughter who was born in 1909. She was the only one. And we've got a picture of her. It's not a great picture. It comes from a newspaper, but it comes from a 1928 edition of the Spokane Daily Chronicle, where she and the other girls had established themselves as talented and attractive members of the high school set at Lewis and Clark High School in Spokane. This is a nice lead in tracking everything down because, again, the caption to that photo listed their address, which matched from that article. It came out more than 20 years later. The family didn't move from Missouri to Washington until sometime between 1920 and 1922. And after that, it was the door was open, Terry. The door was open. A lot of stuff started coming to light.
Yep. Yeah. It's the story is just going to unfold in front of our eyes right now, and it's going to be amazing. Like Ken said, it's filled with theft, murder, game and fish violations. I mean, it's nuts.
Redemption. Forgiveness. Come on,
Yeah.
everything is here. Well, okay, so the Taylor family moves to Washington State in the early 20s. And once there, they start to show up in the newspapers a lot. Mrs. Taylor, Mary Alice, was mostly in the society pages. But Dr. Taylor was often the center of some drama. Mary Alice caught the state record when she was 63 years old. And she's now held the state record for 75 years. She died in April of 1974. She died the day after her birthday, the day after her 89th birthday. And that's really common, Terry. What I've noticed is it's really common when I look these people up that they die on their birthday or a day or two after. I think there's something about that will to live and just maybe reach that
I'm
next
gonna
milestone.
make it. I'm gonna make it to 89, or I'm gonna make it to
Exactly.
90. Yeah. Yep.
Exactly. And, her husband had lived to 89, and she lived to 89. And she is interred in the Riverside Mausoleum at Riverside Memorial Park in Spokane. So if you want to go pay tribute to the state record holder, you can do that. And Terry got the biggest kick out of this chronology, this almost like a little diary of the socialite that was Mary Alice Taylor.
Oh, it goes from 1904 to Ken's pulled out stuff all the way to 1928, and I know of the 10 or 15 newspaper articles that I'm looking at here that it's only probably 20% of what's out there.
Absolutely.
This woman was in the paper every flippin' week for doing. I mean, she was probably. I mean, even through maybe the 80s or the 90s. I mean, she was a typical doctor's wife. She was the socialite. She was the one that was going out and doing artsy, fartsy stuff and things like that. I mean, she was definitely a well-known and probably a well-respected, based upon the newspaper articles that we read, well-respected part of the Spokane, Washington society. And trust me, folks, back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, Spokane, Washington was a Western town. You're talking horses, probably sidearms, all that stuff. It was cow town, horse town.
It's hilarious, and of course, maybe it still happens in some very small towns. When I was growing up in a small town in South Carolina, there was a society page. They did tell you who was having dinner with who, and of course, when you go back 100 years, that was happening in almost every newspaper. So if Mrs. Taylor was hosting a Christmas dinner, or staying with her parents, or having a baby, or judging window displays in some contest, it made the paper. And it was just really interesting. You kind of get a flavor for who these people were.
And so you're talking small towns. So Coeur d'Alene, when I left Idaho in 2013, the population of Coeur d'Alene was only 25,000 people. So imagine what it was 50, 60 years ago.
Well, she was living in Spokane.
Yeah, and Spokane was only, I think it was maybe 100,000 people when I left in 2013. I mean, you're talking small town America. Spokane is not a small area-wise town. It's big. It's spread out quite a bit. So.
Yeah, and the Taylors are in the middle of this community. They're well known. They're probably known to just about everybody. They couldn't have had a lot of dentists there, and she was involved, it seems, in all these societal groups, and they're rocking and rolling. They've got a baby girl. They're obviously prominent members of the community, and then some darkness falls on Mrs. Taylor and her family. In July of 1928, her brother Claude Hurt, who was a bank president in Mobile, Alabama, was killed during an attempted bank robbery. The guy who pulled the trigger was executed, and the man who served as the lookout for the guy who did the killing was given a life sentence. That guy's name was James R. Collins, and he was sentenced to prison for life in Alabama. But 8 years later, Terry, he escaped. He got out of prison, the Collins, the bank robbery lookout, and he ran off to Philadelphia, where he started a new life. He was originally from Mississippi, I think. He's hard to track down because he's using fake names and stuff, but he goes from Alabama to Philadelphia, and he's still a young man. He's still in his 20s at this point. And he gets to Philadelphia, and he starts a new life. He gets married. He has a couple of kids. He starts his own well-digging business. He makes friends. He gets active in the church. And he is on the straight and narrow for 11 years before he gets recaptured in 1947.
Yep.
And he was a pillar of the community by that point. And the folks in Alabama are clamoring for him to be extradited to Alabama so he can get back to serving his life sentence. But what happens?
Well, this is where the redemption comes in. And Miss Taylor, well, this is what she said, in the newspaper article. It says, "I feel like my sisters do. If the man is trying to live a good life and do right, I would be glad to have him set free. I suppose the people who live near him would know more about it, but since he has a wife and a family, I think it would be all right to set him free."
Yeah, the Taylor family, at least the girls, the three daughters, come out and say, yeah, this guy was part of the murder of our brother, but he seems to be on a good path now. Let's send him back to his family. We don't need to see him serve any more time. Yeah. And when did that happen, Terry? When were they saying these things?
It was about what was it?
It was exactly the same month. It was the very same month that she caught the fish. As a matter of fact, it is 9 days after because I know now the date where she caught the state record fish. 9 days after she catches the state record fish, she's saying, turn the guy who was a party to the murder of my brother loose. I'm good with that.
Catching a state record fish makes you have a change of heart.
I don't know about that.
It meant everything to her.
They sound like really charitable people, and very charitable people. And so a month later, in November of 1948, this guy's released. James R. Collins is released, and apparently he goes on and lives a productive remainder of his life. Now let's talk about her husband, though, because her husband is not such a sterling character.
Her husband is probably typical of any male during that time anywhere in the West. I mean, it's the Wild West, for crying out loud, right? I mean...
And he's a dentist from Missouri, which is not exactly, the bright lights of Paris.
Yeah, exactly.
Or New York either. They're both from rural Missouri originally.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Taylor, the dentist, he's surrounded by drama.
Yeah, in a big way. Yeah, so let's look at July 8th, 1923. He's fined $25 in court costs for having pheasants in possession. In his defense, which, trust me, this goes on probably still to this day, was that he was operating a game farm and he raised the birds himself. What's the difference if you're raising them in a pen and you chop their heads off with a freaking knife, or you shoot them with a shotgun? They're your birds. I mean, come on, guys.
Yeah, a lot of states would have no problem with that even today, but
Yeah,
Washington seems like I almost feel like, well, let's go on with some of the other problems he ran into, because after he gets fined $25 for having shot a bunch of pheasants out of season,
yeah.
on his way out of the courtroom, he's served with another warrant. He can't even get out of the courtroom, Terry, before they've hit him up again for exceeding a game bag limit. And a little while later, he's got to surrender his hunting license to the court in Newport, Washington.
Probably exceeded the pheasant game bag limit of the pheasants that he killed on his property that he raised, right?
Yeah, it's just crazy. They're
That's
after
what I'm
this
thinking.
guy.
Yeah.
Same year, he gets arrested in Spokane for violating an anti-noise statute. Apparently, he's got a lot of pets, including dogs and geese, and they were disturbing the neighborhood. 3 days after that, he's hunting. Remember, he's got his hunting license suspended. 3 days after the noise violation, he's arrested and gets his shotgun confiscated for hunting without a license.
But it's not his shotgun.
It's not even his shotgun. That's the hilarious thing to me. It's some treasured shotgun of his pharmacist buddy, some treasured family heirloom or something like that. And the state won't give it back. They will not give the shotgun back, even though doesn't belong to the violator. The pharmacist who owned the shotgun sued the state for it, took it all the way to the highest court in Idaho and lost.
State
Never
Supreme Court.
saw the shotgun again. I wonder what member of the constabulary or judiciary enjoyed that shotgun for many years. But he never got the gun back. That was brutal.
Yeah.
A couple of years later, Dr. Taylor's car gets stolen, and when they find it in some ravine, it's a burnt out shell. Culprits never get caught.
It's 1925. They're burning cars.
Burning cars. This is the early days of some of the violence they have out in Washington and Oregon. 1926, his offices get ransacked and all his dental gold for fillings and stuff like that gets stolen. He gets sued for malpractice in 1928. 1931, one of my favorite incidents here. This is another good one. You can't tell me.
You can't make it up.
You can't make it up, and you can't tell me that these people in Washington, the Washington Game and Fish people, were not after him.
Yeah.
They had a vendetta against this guy. Tell us about the 1931 incident.
All right, so he goes up to Canada hunting.
Where he
kills
is properly
30
licensed.
Properly licensed. He kills 30 ducks in Canada and brings them back to Spokane and gives them to some friends. And unfortunately, ducks were out of season in Washington, so they confiscated the ducks and arrested Dr. Taylor on October 5th. He was acquitted and got his ducks back, but still... I mean, come on, leave the guy alone, for crying out loud. Where's his wife during all of this? Is she just like
she's
cowering under the kitchen table? You know, how did she go to these, debutante, all that? How did she go to there with a straight face?
She must have been humiliated. I mean, because this guy keeps getting in there's just drama around the good doctor. The next year, 1932, burglars break into their home. And they steal 4 of his shotguns and a rifle. This stuff is never recovered. There's a couple of stories out there that indicate that Dr. Taylor was apparently a pretty savvy sportsman. There are stories about him catching limits of bass on fly rods. And there are lots of stories.
Which would have been appropriate at the time.
Yeah. And there are lots of stories about him hunting, obviously, sometimes breaking the rules. In 1935, burglars steal a couple outboard motors from his home, a couple of pairs of boots, some ammunition. And then in 1938, he gets really hit hard. They break into his car and boat trailer, and they steal fishing tackle valued at $250. And Terry, I did the extrapolation on that, the inflation calculator. $250 in 1938 would be $5,500 today.
That's crazy. Yeah, he was a doctor, so yeah, he could probably afford it, but still, $5,500, that's a ton of money.
It's a lot of money, and it doesn't end there. I mean, he he got caught on a migratory bird reserve, and was charged with trespassing. And apparently, they found some shotgun shells out there, and they charged him with having hunted on this property. And get this, this is one of my favorite parts of that little story. The prosecution was so hot and heavy to get him, Terry. They flew a ballistics expert from Washington, D.C. to Washington State to testify against this man. But he was acquitted except for the trespassing charge.
Right. Which, I'm thinking that it's either a cop or it's a cop and a lawyer, or it's a cop, a lawyer, and a judge that are jealous of Mr. Taylor or Dr. Taylor's ability to fish and hunt. And they're jealous of him, and they're going to do everything that they can to keep this guy in his practice or at his house. They don't want him out in the outdoors because he's going to make them look like idiots. It's amazing.
And you got to figure that those other guys who probably had it in for him, their wives were probably part of the same social circles as Mrs. M.W. Taylor.
And they were probably jealous of her, because she was getting, I won't say elected, but asked to do, set up all these parties and do all these meets and the whole 9 yards. And oh man, a woman scorned. So that might have a lot to do with it.
So anyway, searching all these records, I'm going back to when these people were born in the early 1880s until they die in the 1970s. And of course, I'm searching for any other reference to state record largemouth bass in Idaho. And what gets interesting is after that 1949 story, setting it up that the fish was actually caught in October of 1948, the references to her fish become less and less specific.
Yeah.
And they never call her by her birth name. It's always Mrs. M.W. Taylor.
Yep.
And by
they didn't want to do the work that you did. Well,
apparently
they didn't have the ability back then to do the work that you did.
It certainly would have been a different kind of work, but I would think that there would be some pretty good archives and some pretty good indexing within individual newspapers back in the day, but maybe not. But anyway, if they say anything at all about the date of the catch, they usually just say, quote, year unknown. And that's it. And it gets even worse than that if it's possible, because a lot of times they'll point to other fish that weigh less than Mrs. Taylor's fish as being the state record. And there's even a guy with the Idaho Fish and Game Department, a biologist named Jim Humber, who in the 70s is writing stories for these newspapers, and he's saying that the state record bass was caught, quote, a few years ago. Anytime the state record comes up, Humber writes it was caught a few years ago.
Yeah.
But in fact, it was more than 20 years ago by the time he starts writing these stories. And he's a pretty unreliable source anyway, as we'll tell you in a moment. But and you also get some misrepresentations about the fish's weight. Every once in a while, you'll see it pop up not as 10 pounds, 15 ounces, but as 10 pounds, 5 ounces. And let's get into some of these other fish, because when you talk about these other fish, some of these are being referred to as records, even though it turns out they're not. And the first I want to mention, it came from that 1949 article, Terry, that ultimately led me to Mrs. M.W. Taylor. A guy named Leonard Miotke. He caught a 914 from Eloika Lake in April of 1949. And
which I have no clue where Eloika Lake is.
Terry, even I know where Eloika Lake is. It's in Idaho.
Where is Eloika Lake?
It's in Idaho.
Oh my God. Yeah, I know it's in Idaho,
Actually,
but where? Where in
Yeah,
Idaho?
it could be in Washington actually, because at the time that author was talking about the Inland Empire, which apparently is not even a term used anymore in that
No.
area.
Uh-uh.
But it's an area apparently of eastern Washington and the Idaho. Is that called the Panhandle of Idaho?
It would be the Panhandle of Idaho. They call it the Prairie. Is pretty much. I mean, Rathdrum is actually where Brandon Palaniuk's from. But that whole area from Rathdrum over into Spokane is really prairie. Not anymore. It's all houses now. But back then it was known as the Rathdrum Prairie.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Well, this guy Leonard Miotke apparently caught a 914 in 1949 that some writers were willing to call the biggest ever from that region. And and for whatever reason, nobody takes seriously the possibility that a state record largemouth could come from southern Idaho. So it's
No.
dismissed as a potential record area.
Too high.
And
That's too
and
high elevation. It's like 5,000 feet.
yeah, and then in also in 1949, we've got another big fish, and we know almost nothing about that angler. Terry, you can tell us what little we have on him.
Yeah, it's Mr. Simonson catches a 915 from Payette Slough in 1949, and that's all we have. We're
Yeah,
gonna have to do some research on that.
a couple of newspapers call it the state record, but we
Yeah,
already know that in 48, Mrs. M.W. Taylor caught it. And once again, this guy, Jim Humber, the Idaho Fish and Game Department, reaches out and calls it the biggest largemouth authenticated to date in Idaho. Well,
authenticated. That's
maybe.
that. There's nothing wrong with that statement
There's nothing,
because M.W. Taylor's or Miss Taylor's fish was not authenticated. We're all
not as
going
far
off
as
of
we
word
know.
of mouth.
Well, no, wait until the show ends, Terry.
Oh my
I
god!
got information you don't have.
Sorry, yeah, he bastard.
I'm holding out on you. I'm holding out on you. But here's why. Here's why I don't trust Jim Humbird. In May of 1963, he wrote an article for the Idaho Sunday Statesman, and he quotes the great James Henshaw as saying, "What? What is the quote Humbird claims?"
Inch for inch, pound for pound, the smallmouth is the gamest fish that swims,
And
and that
Terry
is a
Battisti,
complete bastardization of Henshaw's words.
exactly.
Yeah,
Henshaw never said it was the smallmouth. He said it was the black bass, and
yeah.
so Humbird is unreliable to me. I'm willing to write him off as completely unreliable because he's misquoted Henshaw, and you dare not do that. You dare not do that, or suffer the wrath of the Big Bass Podcast.
Yeah.
So that's another big fish that came out of Idaho. Simonson's 915 in 1949. Then the biggest bass I was able to find, reported out of Idaho, occurred in April of 1999. And that was a 12.82 pound fish, and that's an estimate, caught from a secret spot near Hagerman, Idaho. The angler was Greg Exner, who was from what town? I can't pronounce it, Terry. You got to help me.
Shoshone.
Shoshone. Okay.
Yeah.
So Exner was trying to qualify for a contest run by Bass and Magazine back in the day called the Big Bass World Championship. And you'd catch a fish and you'd give the measurements. You didn't have to go by pounds and ounces. You'd give the measurements of the fish and submit photos and so forth to Bass and Magazine to qualify. And he was fishing from a float tube, and he submitted the measurements. And I'm going to get your take on those in a moment, Terry, see what you think about those measurements. But he didn't weigh the fish because he didn't want to kill the fish. So he measured the fish and released it. And I'm getting most of this from an article by a guy named Pete Zimowski that was published in the Idaho Sportsman in May of 1999. And Terry, I'm sorry, but I got to quote this story. I apologize to everybody, but these are supposedly quotes from the angler. All right? I want you to listen and tell me if any human being has ever used these words in sentences and said them out loud. I picked a spot that I knew had to hold a monster fish, even though 100 previous casts there had caught 0 fish of any kind. My line went heavy, the sign that a fish had chosen my lure for dinner. She smoked the line from my reel and was within inches of an entangled escape. She lunged forward without even the glimmer of sideways motion. The fish's response was that no drag would keep her from returning to her lair. That is some of the worst writing I've ever seen in my life, and no human being
We're talking.
We're talking. No one has ever said those things. Pete Zimowski, clean it up. That was
you
so
can't blame
bad.
Pete if
There's no way those are quotes. There's no way.
Exner actually said that, then you can't blame Zimowski. All right?
Well, Exner died in 2020 at the age of 67. And there is no way he said those things, because no one would ever say those things. That's worse dialogue than Star Wars, is what that is.
Well, the funny thing is that I've fished all over Hagerman. I am 99.999% sure that I've fished the secret spot near Hagerman. Hagerman is the trout rearing capital of the world. There are more trout hatcheries in the Hagerman Valley, right there near Twin Falls, than anywhere else in the world. Where one hatchery ends, another one picks up. And all the trout that you find in your grocery store in Florida or any state in the United States comes from Hagerman, Idaho.
Very interesting. I had no idea. Idea.
But the water, I mean, yeah, we catch some nice fish in Hagerman, some 4 or 5 pound fish, which are really nice in that part of Idaho. But considering the fact that it's at, 2,500 feet, maybe the bed of the valleys and, less than that, I know it can't be. It's still too flippin' cold. It's part of what they call the banana belt in Idaho. It's part of the warmest area of Idaho. But still, unless that fish was on a diet of vitamin T, which, there's a lot of trout in there.
Sounds very reasonable.
It's possible.
The diet sounds reasonable. 12.82. Yeah. Let's get to 12.82 right now, because we do have some dimensions on this fish. This fish was apparently 23 and a half inches long and 21 and a half inches in girth. What do you think about that?
Well, so the Big Bass Podcast calculator isn't going to do this fish any justice. It's going to overestimate the weight of this fish. And so we're going to have to probably go with the IGFA model, which was done by Don Peters. I have not had a chance to run the numbers through that model. But I'm looking at this and I'm saying that those dimensions quite possibly could be over 12 pounds.
Okay, I was thinking it might be a little below that, but whatever. We're giving the benefit of the doubt, because it's not a state record. It's not a state record.
So for everybody out there, and I don't have my phone with me, so I can't do the calculation. Well, screw it. I'll just pull up Excel right now. Keep talking, Ken. Let me pull.
All right,
up,
I've got, because Excel. I know everybody loves it when I quote bad outdoor writing. I'm going to quote. I'm going to give you another quote from this guy, the late Greg Exner of Shoshone, Idaho, who allegedly caught a 12.82 in 1999. After measuring the fish and getting those length and girth measurements, he allegedly said, "I honored her by returning her to her rightful home. Perhaps someday I, or some other lucky fisherman, will again do battle with the queen of Idaho largemouth bass. What a fish story that will make." Really, come on. Come on. Those are perhaps the worst manufactured quotes I have ever seen in outdoor riding. That's deplorable. Just awful. Nobody talks like that. Come on.
All right, I got to wait.
Okay, 23 and a half inches long, 21 and a half inches in girth, and that works out too by the IGFA.
IGFA 927 model developed by Don Peters works out to 11 and 3/4 pounds or 11 pounds, 12 ounces. So
Okay, so it is a little light.
within,
Okay.
yeah, but what is
But not
I
much.
mean,
That's
if
okay.
that fish has a trout in it, we can remember that model does not consider really the density of the fish.
No. And
So
for the purposes of Mr. Exner's catch, he didn't need weight. They were going strictly by those length and girth measurements at the Big
yeah,
Bass World Championship, and if he qualified as the leader at the end of the season in Idaho, he
yeah,
and the other state champions were going to be going to a special big fish tournament. And
yeah.
I didn't dig into that to see how he did, but I think the year before, or maybe one of the previous years, he came really close to winning it. I think he came within about a quarter pound of winning it one time.
And we
So
actually have a watcher of the Big Bass podcast named Andy Williamson, who lives in South Dakota, who is the leading qualifier for that. He qualified for that thing 8 times
wow,
out of South Dakota. So cheers
that's a
to
lot.
Andy.
There was a guy from in Georgia. I think his name was Paul Hines, and he used to fish these very difficult waters to access that were on military bases, and he always seemed to come up with a 15-pounder in Georgia when I was living in Georgia, and yeah, I think those contests are. I know the guys who have the rights to that contest, and they talk about resurrecting it one day. I think that might be interesting. All right, one more big fish out of Idaho that we want to mention. This is one of the most recent, truly big bass, and that was caught by an angler named J.J. Schillinger. And Terry, this one came from basically that same area.
Yeah, yeah. So we talked about the Coeur d'Alene River, and it had 9 lakes off of it. And every one of these 9 lakes, so you can navigate with a bass boat up the Coeur d'Alene River, and all 9 of these lakes you can get into with a bass boat. It's really a cool fishery. They're not oxbows; they're actual lakes. And this 9.7 pound fish came out of a lake called Cave Lake, which my old team partner in Idaho, Brian Quinnett, and I actually got second place in 1998 at the goodness gracious, it was the North Idaho Bassmasters or whatever the club was. And anyway, came out of Cave and in 2019, and it's the current catch and release record at 25 inches.
Yeah, and you mentioned you and your buddy finishing second in that tournament. This guy caught his fish in a tournament too. He was
Yeah,
fishing
it
in
was
the
actually the
Panhandle.
Panhandle Bass Angler. Yeah, that's the club I belong to,
Oh wow,
and that's the club that hosts the Open. They have an Open every July. So
excellent. I wonder if he was a club member or just a guy out there cherry picking. But congrats to Mr. Schillinger, a really big fish, and probably about as close to a certified big bass as you're going to get out of Idaho.
yeah, without a
Certainly
doubt.
the closest thing to a legit certified fish that we know about that's in
Yeah,
that weight class. All right, Terry, we're,
yeah.
we're getting close to wrapping this one up. What are your takeaways here?
Well,
Mrs. Wait a sec. Wait. Mary Alice Hurt Taylor. The long forgotten, long lost Mary Alice Hurt Taylor. Should she have the state record in Idaho, or should that be taken away?
All right. Well, since you have been withholding from me, it's very difficult to say. But with the data that I have in front of me, we're going off of a stated weight. I don't know that this fish was ever weighed on anything but a bathroom scale. If it was weighed at a meat market and had witnesses, I might say, yeah, let's keep it.
Oh, we don't
But
even
if
have
it
photos
wasn't,
of this fish. We got no photo. I cannot even find a photo of
of course you
Mrs.
can't.
Taylor.
She ate it.
Probably did.
She fed it to her, debutante friends in order to keep her husband in good graces.
No doubt true. So what you're saying is based on what you know, you might advocate that the record be vacated and
Yeah, and that 915 and the 915 put into place.
well, and of course the 915 is not exactly bulletproof either, but I get what you're saying. Now, are you ready for the big
Yeah,
reveal?
yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to start by saying that going into this story, I anticipated that this would be the record, the first record that we would actively advocate to have vacated. After all, there's almost no information on Mrs. M.W. Taylor's fish. But then, Terry, I found something that got my attention. I found a newspaper article. It was about Idaho fish generally. And it said that in 1944, Mrs. Mary A. Taylor, that's the same person as Mrs. M.W. Taylor,
Yeah.
said it in 1944, she finished sixth in the annual Field and Stream fishing contest with a
Wow.
9-pound, 11-ounce largemouth from Anderson Lake. So that's already more information than we know about their state record. So then what did I do? Well, of course, I checked my limited library of Field and Stream contest winners. And lo and behold, I
Her
had
name's in there.
1944. I had 1944. I was just lucky there. And I can tell you that 1944 lunker was caught on October 21st, the same month as the state record. Also came from Anderson Lake, of course, same as the state record. I can even tell you something about the gear she was using in 1944. It was a Granger rod, a Shakespeare reel, gladding fishing line, and she was using a Hedden River runt. And what do we know about those applications for the Field and Stream contest? They
And have
required
two witnesses.
witnesses in a certified scale.
Yep.
And guess what? She also entered her state record in the Field and Stream contest in 1948, and she finished second in the Northern Division. And all the information is there. She caught the record.
No.
She caught the record on October 22nd, 1948,
Holy crap.
using a South Bend rod, a Shakespeare reel, Ashaway line, and a Pfluger Palamine lure. Instead of being completely suspect, like I was imagining going in,
He becomes 100%.
I think there's a pretty good argument. I think there's a pretty good argument, Terry Battisti, that Mary Alice Hurt Turner is the greatest big bass angler in the history of Idaho. How about that?
Okay. I can't doubt you now. When you were texting me this stuff a little while ago, I thought you were on a crap or something.
I was torturing Terry. I was torturing Terry because I did the bulk of the research on this one, the bulk of the dive, and so I'm trying to fill him in on where I'm at as we go into
Yeah.
the recording, and I held out all that stuff at the end because I got it right at the end.
Yeah.
I didn't know that 3 hours before we started to record, and that just broke the whole thing loose, and that makes me have tremendous confidence in Mrs. M.W. Taylor.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy. Good for her. Good for her.
Absolutely. This is a woman who apparently did things right. She must have been a very avid angler to have caught such big fish like that. We know that Dr. and Mrs. Taylor had a houseboat on the Coeur d'Alene chain. And I put in a call today to the Idaho Fish and Game Commission to share with them some of the stuff that I was able to dig up. And I'm hopeful that they will update their records to better
Did you
reflect.
talk to him or did you just leave him a message?
I had to. The guy I need to talk to was not in. I'm hoping he'll call me back. At the very least, I do have his. I'll get his email address, and I will send him a link to this show if I can't get him on the phone. But I hope they'll update their records because they've got the sketchiest records in all.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. That would
in
be
all of
awesome
bass
if they'd
fishing.
update them.
Yeah.
Or even, put an article in their state regs book or on the website, commemorating her. I mean, that's a pretty cool deal. She won it twice. The Field and
Well,
Stream
she finished
Northern Division.
sixth once, and she finished
Well, it
second
didn't
once.
win it. Yeah, it
she
didn't
never
win it.
actually won, but she was in the hunt.
But she was in the hunt, and she was in Field and Stream. I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah, that was the place to be if you were catching big fish. And I can't find that she was ever in there another time, but I'm also missing some of those Field and Stream records.
Sounds like she was a better fisherman than her husband.
Sounds like it. He was apparently pretty good with the fly rod, but she's out there using casting gear and getting it done. I'm certain that she had bragging rights in the Taylor family.
Damn, I'm pissed that you got all this info, and you're from northern Cuba, and I actually lived in this state of Idaho for over 20 years and consider it, home.
Well, here's the awkward thing. I actually have a photo of Mrs. Mary Alice Hurt Turner. Unfortunately, it's a photo of, I believe, the Hurt family. And there are, I think, 4 women in this photo that we're going to put up right now. And I have no idea which one she is. No idea. I don't know the date of the photo, don't know anything. But she's in this photo somewhere, folks. Somewhere in this image is the state record holder for Idaho largemouth bass.
Awesome.
And with that, Doctor, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think it's time to slam the door on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. Thanks for joining us. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending a little bit of it with us. If you enjoyed the show, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you could do us a big favor, please recommend the show at least to one friend, maybe 5. And if you do that, we could double our audience in no time at all. If you're a Big Bass junkie, check out the website at thebigBassPodcast.com. You'll find the Big Bass Podcast Calculator, good for bass over 14.5 pounds. And we have lists of state record largemouth, smallmouth, and spots. And if you'd like to contact us, you can reach us via email at ken@thebigBassPodcast.com, terry@thebigBassPodcast.com, and nathan@thebigBassPodcast.com. Please join us again soon, and we'll bring you another story about another big bass that you will not and cannot find anywhere else.
And
Ken,
thank you again, Casey Hepworth.
yeah. And Ken, what's everybody supposed to remember?
Remember that size matters.